Okay, great. Um, Hello and welcome. I hope you're having a good day or evening wherever you are. My name is Madhushri, and I am a co-founder and volunteer at Decolonizing Our Bookshelves, which is a digital humanities project geared towards making literature by authors of marginalized identities more accessible and visible. I'll be moderating this session brought to you by the Rethinking Economics India Network and Expanding Economics. The Rethinking Economics India Network is the India chapter of the global Rethinking Economics movement. They operate as a nationwide ecosystem of stakeholders in the space of pluralist and heterodox economics. They're looking to interface with individuals, academia, and civil society organizations in order to encourage teaching, learning, and discussions for scaling collaborative efforts towards better, more inclusive economics for India and contribute towards the global movement at large. Expanding Economics is a student club based in McGill University and an affiliate with the Global Rethinking Economics Network. Their goal is to promote pluralism in economics curriculum, and they aim to achieve this primarily through events on campus that present heterodox schools of economic thought to the student body and fostering discussion and creating awareness. As for today's AMA, I'll provide a brief outline. During the first part, I will be chatting with our guest, Guppi Bola, and the latter part will be open for the participants to post their questions in the question box, which should be visible to you on the menu bar on your screen. We encourage you to upvote questions you like so that it is easier for us to select questions. Moving on, our guest for today is Guppi Bola. Guppi Bola is a racial justice busybody committed to building an economic democracy that supports multiracial working class communities to access wealth and resources needed to facilitate collective healing. She has an academic background in public health, which she uses to focus her strategic thinking on the root causes of social inequality and ill health. Sometimes she writes things. Her most recent piece was called Reimagining Public Health, a follow up to her stint as interim director of MedAct. She is one half of Double Trouble at Decolonizing Economics, a consulting collective working to build a solidarity economy movement in the UK that is rooted in racial justice. She is currently chair of the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. Hi, Guppi. It's very exciting to talk to you.
Hi, everyone.
Um, so I guess I'll just start my the session with my first question, which is what motivated you to delve into the space of decolonizing economics, and why do you think it is important, especially in the context of the global South?
Great. Thanks for having me. I know it's 7:30 where you are, and also just such a commitment on a Saturday night when actually in India you could be going out and doing lots more things than we can do at the moment in the UK because we're still under lockdown. But yeah, so appreciate you spending some time with me this evening. It was really enjoyable having questions like this to think about because uh, I'm 35, and I guess I've been doing this work for about 15 years as an organizer and an activist. And it is maybe really useful to reflect back on how learning journey around decolonizing is so non-linear and also so unpredictable. And I was thinking about the sort of big moments, and actually the big moments were quite small moments. They were like very niche and very subtle points at which quite large shifts in my thinking and my motivations had occurred. So I'm really, grateful for considering this. So my background, as you mentioned, is both in public health as well as in climate change activism. And it was only about 5 or 6 years ago that I started recognizing the centrality of the economic system as a infrastructure that determines so much within our world. And economics was always, so especially during my master's when I was doing public health, kind of taught as a very separate theory, which has its own science and its own kind of, not even ideologies, but its own mechanisms, I guess, in a very objective way, in a very depoliticized way. And as I moved into an organization that was looking very specifically at economic systems change, I began to understand much more deeply about how the economy really determines so much of, well, it determines everything. And those who determine what it does are the people who are most readily express social power. So whiteness, maleness, ableism, and class privilege. And yeah, I kind of got into it through, kind of got into decolonizing economics and motivated by it through the kind of merging of my intellectual person and my personal experiences. And I think that's maybe, I find that reflection really interesting, because I think what it also has taught me is that transformative ideas or learnings about ideas often come to people with a relative amount of privilege quite late in their life. Whereas what I see now in, particularly with Noni, who is my organizing partner, has been politicized and active from a very, very young age, from like 15, 16, and I think even before that, because their experiences of the world have been so much more conducive to her understanding the political ideologies that shape us. Whereas I think, you know, I grew up in a very safe middle-class household. My parents run their own business. I went to university. Quite a lot of my life has been pretty well protected until about 6 or 7 years ago, when I was really beginning to recognize quite a lot of harmful behaviors within a very white male dominant space. So in this organization, I was responsible for organizing and working alongside European activists. And at that point, there was just a lot going on, a lot of racialized, I guess I would just call it shit, basically, going on in Europe, which is, you know, there was the so-called migrant crisis, which was basically like severe anti-migrant sentiment within the media, a real rise in far-right politics, like close to neo-fascism in European political parties and political rhetoric. Plus there was the kind of resurgence of movement for Black Lives. And the spaces I was working in, having conversations about what systems change were so focused on climate and fossil fuels. And all that anyone wanted to talk about was, how are we going to shift the system away from an overuse of natural resources, but without any consideration about the interlinkages between racialized oppression or structural racism within the environment itself. And there was a very superficial conversation around like diversity and a very superficial understanding of intersectionality, which frustrated me, because it continued to park a part of my experience into like a side conversation that sort of had to be dealt with without there being a coherent or strategic understanding of like how central that was. And one of the interviews I did on this that really helped my thinking was when I was like, I don't care if we solve climate change if it means that you're still going to be a dick to me. And I think that like has basically shaped quite a lot of the motivations of the work within Decolonizing Economics, is to try to identify like what the roots of our economy are, and why it is that we have structural racism, and why it is that we have structural like sexism and gender oppression, as well as all of the other oppressions that exist. Whereas people would sort of talk about it as two separate things without seeing the patterns behind it. So yeah, there was a frustration around that. And then also that led me to really being encouraged, I guess, to read more. So one of the, really to find my language around it, because I was just frustrated without really having much of my own coherent message. So the one line of theory that has really helped me is from bell hooks. And bell hooks ultimately describes the system that we live in as the capitalist, imperialist, white supremacist patriarchy. And that just suggests that, the patriarchy is the fundamental system that has attached to it a capitalist, imperialist, and white supremacist character to it, and that plays out in many different ways, and there's absolutely no way in which you can pull any of those apart, and they cannot be seen as separate either. And there is just some really great writing about the dynamics of those four systems at play together that she writes about, and many other organizations write about. Another really great organization that shaped the way I think about this, and then I also share those ideas and those frameworks and constructs within workshops, is a collective in the US called Aorta, who produce anti-oppression resource trainings. And they're a worker co-op, and they've just got some really good, kind of very clean and concise ways of expressing this. And then, I think it kind of, the motivation really came to a head in 2000, or not came to a head, was more clarified in 2017, and basically two things were happening at the same time. Firstly, it was 70 years since partition, and it was also the year after my marriage. So I married a South Indian who had in 2015 moved to the UK to be with me, and we married and we've settled here. And I think it's taken quite a while as a real personal transformation around seeing him as someone from India move to the UK, and knowing my privileges of being a British passport owner and holder, and living and being brought up here, and knowing the codes of Britishness, and knowing the codes of working in the kind of professional scene, to really get me to interrogate my own entitlements as a British person, even if I have brown skin and a family who were brought up in India. So the anniversary of partition was really important to me, because I spent the entire year really uncovering quite a lot of history that I just did not know. Like, I did not know the role that the British have played in so much of what has shaped India today, and what has shaped South Asia today, not just in its kind of geopolitics, but just in its cultural ideas and in the ways in which people engage with each other. And that was embarrassing to me, right? Like, there's a reason why my family, my grandparents, who were at the hands of that they experienced it at firsthand, never talked about it. But the embarrassment was, it was never a conversation in our family. And that there were choices that were made in my family and completely understandable, but also there was no education in that happened at school around this. And I just willingly went through life just not really understanding all of this. And so, that was really, we wrote a blog about it. I can share the link. I think the link's on my website. And the more and more I got into it, I basically just became absolutely obsessed by British colonial history. Like, the thing that I would do to relax would be watch old BBC documentaries on the Empire, and go to the British Museum and try to identify tours, and slowly finding just how much, not just what has existed in India or in South Asia, but also in London and in Oxford, that is a result of wealth that has been extracted from all of colonized countries, and enabled Britain to be what it is today. That just became my fascination, and I just see that practice of unpeeling those layers of history, a real motivator for me, that then transferred into my understanding of economics as well. And then the other was being asked by someone I've known for quite a long time who runs a magazine called Stir to Action to write a article on power, and it's quite a broad kind of request, but I'd moved out of the organization I was working in, and I was sort of in a funny place where I was in another role, a similar role, but I was given much more freedom in that role to explore the kind of relationship between structural racism and the economy. And so I just kind of went for this inkling that I had that there are reasons why we see patterns of structural inequality within groups of people. And I had made a focus on gig economy workers. So people who work on like platforms such as Uber and Deliveroo, who are in significantly precarious jobs and have zero protections. And I think this also, interestingly, this narrative kind of plays out also within the COVID pandemic and who is hit first and worst. And I was just so frustrated by the real classist and racist kind of reasonings that people had as to why Black people and people of color are the first to be affected by a tragedy or by something of structural design. You know, some of the reasonings as to why Black people were among the most affected by the COVID pandemic were they don't wash their hands enough, or, you know, they live in overcrowded houses and they choose to live in certain setups and they choose to have certain jobs without there being any consideration as to the long line of events that put people in situations within their lived experience that are completely out of their control. And so this article kind of explored that idea as to like, why do we see these patterns recreated in almost any social setup? And it basically goes right back to the way that the economy was structured around, the sort of 16th, 17th century, when capitalism, feudalism moved towards mercantilism and then moved towards capitalism. And that's basically now the fundamental economy that we have in its many different forms currently in a accelerated neoliberalism / late stage. You can call it what you want, but like for me, it's still capitalism and it's still incredibly extractive. And so writing articles became my way of like positing a question that I wanted answered and trying not to write it like this is definitely the answer. But sometimes I just got so frustrated at how little people were even questioning constructs and really like thinking about the roots of the economy beyond like the establishment of neoliberal capitalism in the 1930s and 40s. Like they didn't want to go anywhere past that. And a large part of that is because a lot of them were white. And a large part of that was because a lot of them didn't want to address racism. They didn't want to address their own racism. They didn't want to address the kind of the globalized elements of white supremacy, because what it would then mean is that they as a group of like progressive lefties become redundant or become responsible for where we are now. And I think there's a real interesting reckoning happening at the moment around like that positionality, which I find really interesting. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the motivation has continually been like recognizing my own growth into a colonial mindset and how important unlearning is to identify and come back to my true self, which is not only important for my personal relationships, but is important for my politics as well. And I think that there is just a really important, they're just really simple ways in which we can think about this stuff. So like I wanted to read, if it's okay, I wanted to read like a small excerpt, a small bit of writing.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
From our friend who we quote a lot, Nim Ralph, who's a trans activist and a climate justice organizer. And they, very eloquently kind of express this. And I think that like the colonial mindset is so important to understand because it's so intricate, the way it plays out, and there's just so much you can unravel through it. So I'll just go through this little quote. They say that there are many parallels in the ways that humans extract from the planet and create borders and control to police populations in the service of profit. And the way that humans extract what they need from the bodies of people and create borders between the bodies of people and control us in the service of profit. And many of the ways we understand and categorize people in the modern world were constructed explicitly by Northern Europeans in order to justify their project of global dominance and wealth accumulation, i.e. colonialism. And this was done via the industrial capitalism in the 19th century. They needed a workforce to deliver that expansion and extraction from the planet. And there were certain types of bodies that were deemed useful or not useful in that conquest. The colonizers assigned values to different human life to morally justify themselves, the degradation and dehumanization of different people in pursuit of personal wealth. A key function of that dehumanization was to reduce people's bodies, reduce people to bodies, and to reduce bodies to vessels of labor, or another way of thinking about that is tools of production. So Black bodies were enslaved to provide free or forced labor to expand the extraction of resources for Europe, while disabled people were deemed unfit as they couldn't produce labor needed in the industrial workforce. And LGBTQ plus people were deemed immoral because they weren't able to reproduce for the workforce that was needed for industrial expansion. And I just think those constructs and those ideas are at play every single day in our modern life, and they play such a big role in the way I was brought up. You know, even my family have ideas around certain groups of people that I've had to challenge, knowing that they stem from a colonial ideology that was obviously instilled at the time the British were in India. And that sort of leads me to the thinking around why is this important for the global South? And I think that question is just so complex because not only have global South populations been the subjects of so much violence and gaslighting and like the fascination that Britain has been able to cause a lot of crap in these countries and then find a way to blame you or blame the global South for the problems it faces by itself is like quite incredible. And so it is the global South who should be at the center of like any transformation, any investment of reparative justice, of collective healing, of answers to how we get out of this mess. And I think the other thing that, the writer that I'm really driven by is Adrienne Maree Brown, and she writes about particularly the experience of Black people, and she writes, imagination is one of the spoils of colonization, which in many ways is claiming who gets to imagine the future for a given geography. Losing our imagination is a symptom of trauma. Reclaiming the right to dream about the future, strengthening that muscle to imagine together as Black people is a revolutionary decolonizing act. We are living in the ancestral imaginations of others, with their longing for safety and abundance, a longing that didn't include us. We are living now inside the imagination of people who thought economic disparity and environmental destruction were acceptable costs for their future. It is our right and our responsibility to write ourselves into the future. And I feel like that is just so, that is like the central focus of decolonizing economic strategy, which we can go on to in like the next question. But just knowing how much of the history of the world is written by white people, and knowing how much of the future of the world is currently being written by white people in the concept of like rethinking or new economics that has no understanding or no desire to embrace the complexities of intersectionality and colonial history. That is really the reason why I'm so impassioned by the ideas around decolonizing, because there is so much to uncover around the truth, but there is also so many incredible gifts and leadership within the global South that is necessary for our answers to how we get out of neoliberal capitalism or racial capitalism. And this sort of new economy movement is ultimately a rebranding of what we know as ancestral practices that exist within either communities in the global south or in migrant communities in the global north, and has done for centuries. Whether you call it kind of solidarity economics or like mutual aid, collective community organizing, all of that is really centered around abundance and caring, and an interrelationship with nature. And yeah, I think that's really important. And I also feel like maybe particularly for South Asia or for India, what feels essential right now is understanding the experience of being subject to colonialism, but also understanding how much of the mindset has been embedded into the economy and politics of India, and how that plays out within society. And you know this already, so thinking about kind of queer liberation and anti-Blackness that is pretty rife, disability justice, and the rights of disabled people, challenging kind of gender binaries, and really, like, we've got a lot of work to do in the South Asian community here, who are consistently voting in the Conservative Party, which is incredibly problematic. But yeah, there's a lot, there's significant levels of inequality, and ultimately a fascist government in India that we really need to work towards, because without that, you both got to work sort of within the places that we're located in, but also within ourselves, and then seek to create a space for kind of global South leadership as well within the global stage, which is why I think the Rethinking Economics network is just really great. Just really love that you have that solidarity in practice as a network. Anyway, that was my first, sorry, that was quite a long response to the first question, but yeah.
No, it was great. It's always great to hear another Bell Hooks or Adrian Marie Brown fan talk. So yeah, I actually picked on something very interesting that you were referring to in your answer. You spoke about how you discovered like the linkages between public health, climate change, and structural racism. And for example, in India, casteism plays like the biggest, it's like one of the biggest problems that we're facing right now. And I want to understand, so the work you do is also pretty cool. From your website, you have said that you deliver workshops, support grassroots community organizing. I want to understand how exactly you go about it, and how has your experience been? How did you come about these strategies? Because they're pretty new and very like interesting. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's very subtle. There are like 2 or 3 pretty fundamental, I don't know, I wouldn't even say texts, I'd just say ideas or frameworks that are central to our strategy. And maybe the easiest, so I will send a link, but the most, what's the word? The most like influential that didn't really like drive me forward, but like just settled my thinking. I was like, oh, right, that makes sense now, which is a paper called From Banks to Tanks to Cooperation and Caring, which is written by Movement Generation. And look, I apologize for all of these being US. They're all US organized organizations and activist groups, and I'm like supremely conscious of that. And I don't necessarily think that because they've managed to put ideas into like a handy 6-page pamphlet, that means that the US is like the center and font of all knowledge. Like, I believe that these ideas have stemmed from communities of color who hold a very deep relationship to their ancestral backgrounds, and particularly with Movement Generation, I think that they are really led by Indigenous practices, and the Black community. So anyway, that's just saying that, being real about like where these ideas have come from. But in this particular paper, there are 2 things. One is, and this is obviously quite simple knowledge for you, like that the economy is like the words economy and its kind of etymology suggest that we can make the decision about how we manage our own house, and it doesn't have to be structured this way, and it could be structured for a very different purpose. And so the drive around Decolonizing Economics initiative is to create an economic democracy in which everyone is able to participate, but not like everyone could participate, but who has been locked out of participating in the economy in the past, and why reparative justice is so central to the way we move forward, which is put Indigenous people, put Black people, and put brown people at the front of that decision-making process, and be at the front of receiving the first of whatever reparative justice program exists. And there's also a framework which is super handy when you're doing workshops, which is like, this is the way the current extractive economy operates, and for this purpose, which is it's run on a colonial mindset, it's governed by militarism, it's for the purpose of extracting resources from people and from the planet, and it creates wealth in the hands of a few people. And this is the process we have to go towards in order to get to what they refer to as the living or the regenerative economy, which is purpose of the economy should be around care and care and resilience, and that it should be governed by deep democracy, and that its focus should be on sort of social equity, and then those are the two kind of opposing places we're at and where we need to get to. But what I find really useful in this diagram is the strategy towards that has a real focus on racial equity and social equity, and that our practices moving towards the world we want to create has to really embody the practices that we want to see happen, and how easily it is to like leave racial equity or social equity out of that practice, because particularly around issues of climate, people are just consistently talking about fossil fuels as if that's the only thing that's a problem within our world. So that basically like helps determine what we do. So when we do our work was very focused on the first bit, which was uncovering the colonial mindset and the financial infrastructure within the City of London, particularly, that was developed during the colonial era, but was developed for the purpose of the exploitation of Black people, the exploitation and death of Black people, ultimately. And so one of the things that Noni and I guess, like, what do you call it? Our inquiry was if the establishment of like financial instruments like assets and stocks and shares and derivatives and everything that still exists within the City of London as a financial exchange market now occurred because on the docks of London, when goods were coming in from that were extracted from colonized countries and then traded for bodies that were then sent out through the Atlantic trade routes, like why, or like what makes us think that the financial system isn't operating in the same way now? And of course it does, like we know it does, but it's just making that relationship between what happened 400 years ago and what happens today to people who are never taught that history. So we do a lot of that uncovering, and quite embarrassingly, I have a crush on a social historian in the UK called David Olusoga, who wrote a book called Black and British, and was also the presenter on, if he happens to ever watch this, I would happily go for a cup of tea with him. Yeah, he did a program called Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, and that was a kind of popular documentary that reflected a research project that I think UCL did on those who gained from the slave compensation scheme. Yeah, so we do a lot of the kind of uncovering, and currently we've commissioned bits of research around the tax system and around the finance system to look at that colonial history and how it plays out. And I think what we are really happy about is in the last 3 or 4 years, lots more people are asking that question, and a lot of it is not necessarily in academia. So what we had to do was take a lot of what was in academia and like create a language around it that was accessible for activists and campaigners. But we see that happening more and more. So what that has meant for us is, okay, we don't have to focus on like justifying that white supremacy fits within the capitalist economy and that there is an interrelationship there. It sounds like people understand and like are more familiar with the concepts of racial capitalism, and that's great. So now we've shifted a little bit more to like the strategy of building it, which has always been the question. It's like, okay, well, the left are really good at analyzing, but not so good at imagining. And what we are really keen to do is just to create the space for that leadership to come from the imagination of like what exists and what can exist in the future and what the economy will be in Black and brown communities in the UK and internationally through our international relationships. So we are doing that in multiple different ways, but one of our central focuses is to, well, it's kind of it sounds really weird when we talk about it, but working out ways of moving money that is ultimately in people who have inherited wealth directly into the hands of communities who are ready to organize around collective ownership initiatives, whether that's community land trusts, co-housing, worker cooperatives, or any form of kind of like collective ownership that basically bypasses the state. Because I think for so long, the progressive ideas of like what we need to happen is that the state needs to provide, like we need to fund the NHS, we need to make sure we have public services, and all of those things are so essential. But we've gone through 10 years of austerity under Tory rule, and like I don't think a Labour government is ever going to come and save us. And in order to create an economic democracy, we can't rely on the political system as it's structured now, because it's fundamentally undemocratic. And the only way to get a truly democratic economy is if those who have had the most of their wealth extracted from them to be the first to receive wealth and design themselves towards their own needs, and then to be at the center of that kind of creative ideology around what care and solidarity actually means and what it looks like, which is why we have a focus on multiracial working class communities. And yeah, so we're hoping to do some investment in kind of cooperative spaces. We're doing a lot of popular education around that strategy idea, doing a lot of organizing with people with inherited wealth, and continuing to kind of create capacity within activists and organizers who want to do more educational workshops on like the history of racial capitalism and just researching that history a little bit more. So that's kind of our jam, really.
That is pretty cool. And yes, you are absolutely right. The left is really good at analyzing. And in fact, that kind of leads me to my question. So the education that you do is very geared towards community-driven mobilization. And your work also has shifted from, just like talking points about fossil fuels and stuff to like redistribution of wealth, which is pretty cool. And so like as students who are trying to engage with these I mean, they've been brought into the mainstream they're pretty new. If you speak about like mainstream student politics, how do you suggest we engage in this work? How do we decolonize our spaces?
Well, I mean, thinking back to my university days, which feel really far away now, to 2004. So yeah, quite a while. University was really important for me as a space of building relationships. It can become the microcosm of the way the world operates. You just have like a real diversity of people with different opinions. I think inherently university students and universities like are quite politically leaning towards the left, possibly. but actually I don't. Yeah, I know less about the kind of constructs in India. But I think seeing it as a place to, if I was given guidance back in those days, it is like the place to really sharpen your tools. Like, you have so much scope for experimentation of ideas, but also of practices. And I think it's like the practice that is probably the most important around collective organizing and solidarity and that unlearning, right? You're in an institution that is really traditional in its ideas. Rethinking is similar to decolonizing economics, is born out of frustration of what is being taught by major institutions who maintain an idea around power that doesn't fit within our idea of social justice. And so you're having to struggle internally with like transforming the institution and recognizing its inherent flaws and weaknesses, as well as doing that as an internal practice for yourselves, but collectively as well as a group. And I would love to have had someone encourage me to like look outwards from the institution as well, and not to be so focused on like just what was happening immediately around me, because I think that would have better prepared me around relationships and and just understanding life outside like quite a privileged space. So you get a lot of people at university from very different backgrounds, but you also don't, right? There is a massive privilege around being at university, and there's like a whole horde of people who didn't go to university and who it's completely out of scope for them to even connect with that idea that they might go. So yeah, pushing yourself to make those relationships and testing yourself a lot and thinking about how privileged the experience is that doesn't include everyone. And the other thing is like challenging yourself around what the notions of like achievement and success are. And I think that is so hard, right? Because you're doing coursework and you've got exams and you're like in your kind of like your spaces for kind of intellectual learning, and just embodying the idea of success being something very different to just like the intellectual scape. So like I said, I'm 35. From having had a very difficult experience in my professional life at the age of 30, I'm only just now realizing that my entire existence has been centered around what's in here and not like my body and my heart. And I've heard as I've grown up like a lot of reflections of how important it is to nourish your whole self, and only you can go on that journey to learn it. And hopefully that doesn't come at a point where you've experienced like some kind of trauma or some kind of like bad experience that means that you have to move in that direction, that you've fostered like a good practice around self-care and collective care, not just self-care, with each other, to sustain yourself, to sustain your activism, and to move beyond just the kind of intellectual ideas around economics, to be able to fully embody economics as a move towards a care-based economy and a solidarity-based economy, which is ultimately about relationships, trust, and compassion, which is something that I think, if only there was a degree in that, but there isn't. That's just life. And that's the thing that we need to exercise a lot more.
Thank you. I have, so you spoke during your first answer, you mentioned how reading about the history of partition, that was like very, it took you on a personal journey. And I'm very, I think right now there has been a lot of conversation about allyship. And so there, you also had to come to, you not only had to come to terms with colonial oppression, but also sort of come to terms with your positionality as someone living in the UK. And so how have you sort of, how has that shaped your definition of good allyship? And
Yeah, what a question. I feel allyship is such a personal, I mean, it's maybe actually a term that I try not to identify with. So it is really an effort to master your experience as an individual who has faced both trauma and oppression, and and lived with privilege, and to understand then where to, the simple thing of saying yes to this panel and working out whether you are the right person to take a position on a stage and to hold, to hold a position, hold a voice, and hold a platform. And I've only really, I mentioned before, one of the most important things around organizing towards a solidarity economy is the relationships, and it really is like the thing that drives me. And the only way in which I've identified how to work with others, largely at an individual level, is in building very deep, trusting relationships with them. And because one of the latter questions, which will be around like, inspirations, there are many folks who have inspired me from an intellectual perspective, but my real inspirations are from my closest organizing partners. So I mentioned Nim, who I've worked with pretty consistently over the last 2 or 3 years on different projects. And Nim and I just have a working relationship and a friendship that enables us to just do real talk. And similar with Noni, Noni's of African descent and has many different life experiences to me. And Noni will just give me real talk around like my choices, when I've sort of stepped in too far, when I've not stepped in enough, when they need me like to show up in a certain way, and then I've like made the effort to like be that person consistently without that having to be having to rely on someone else to kind of shape or inform you, by picking up and recognizing patterns of your own behaviors that will either dominate others or dominate a space. And there's a real art to learning to step up or step back. And it really is, shaped by the way you connect and engage with others through a deep learning relationship where you're both committed to the same thing. And I feel incredibly, I'm incredibly privileged to hold those relationships in my life and to be able to have that personal learning. But that's saying that as well, like the other things that are really essential because sometimes the shift is so difficult because the shift happens like in your head, right? Like you can read multiple writers of color from various backgrounds, reading work around disability justice and the experience of disabled people is like so essential because people have made the effort to put that work out to like share their experiences of the world so that you can come at life with multiple perspectives of how a particular situation is playing out. But it's not, again, it's not just in here, right? Like your body has to move in a completely different way. That is a practice that only you can engage in, like only you can respond to stuff. And it's interesting now how I flinch at certain words and I flinch at certain behaviors because I have seen it being harmful to others. And I know what that experience is because I also then can connect it to like other experiences I might have had. And yeah, just knowing when it's your time to just be like, this is not okay, and basically be an active bystander. The other thing I'd say about allyship is on the spectrum of things that we need to get to in terms of like privilege experiences versus oppressed experiences. Like, I know I have to lose many things in this process. So the process that we are undertaking of like a strategy towards reparative justice also has to include like my own the minimization of my own power as well. And that is an interesting and complicated experience as someone who is trying to found an initiative. And one that I'm like consistently thinking about and consistently reflecting on. I think that that is a little bit like conceptual, but hopefully possibly answers your question.
It does. And that was a very profound, like the last part where you said that we have to come to terms with losing some parts. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck, including myself. And yeah, that was a great answer. So I think we will be moving on to, we'll be opening the floor to participant questions now. And one of our participants asks, what do you think is the role of personal narratives and personal history in the process of decolonizing economics? And what are some of the biggest challenges you face as someone seeking to decolonize economics in the UK?
Oh, great. Such good questions. So the movement generation paper I told you about, the strategy for them, achieving that framework came about through story spaces that they held with marginalized communities across the US. So they created, I think they did multiple residentials and like workshops where they basically built relationships with various community organizations who were at the kind of front line of the extractive economy within the US, and gave them the space to tell their experience of the economy, to then identify how they would narrate what seems like a very simplified version of a very complex system, but it came from personal narrative, right? And just thinking about that complexity and how important it is to hear the different ways in which people experience the economy. And when I say that, I mean like how they live, like how they experience life is ultimately like how they experience the economy, because what barriers they come up with, what, you know, even from the experience of a white person, right? Like how limited. I sometimes feel really bad for white people because I'm like, your experience of life is just so narrow. Like, and then particularly white men as well. It's like not so narrow in terms of ideas. Like it just makes me so boring. And then also that, but then your emotional scape as well is just so narrowed because the world has been created in a way where like you just have to step forward and there it is. Whereas like the experience of oppressed people is that they have to, find a little nook or like climb over something or like swim, to get to a destination that has been designed for another person. And so to identify those barriers that are ultimately, they were designed into the economy for a reason, to hold people back. We can't get that until we really hear from those who are left behind by the extractive economy. So really fundamental. And then again, as I said, giving that space to dream about an alternative is also essential, to come through personal narrative, and not just personal narrative, like stories, songs, music, arts, poetry, all of the kind of creative practices. For me, my practice is pottery, and I'm a bit sad that I haven't been able to like go to the pottery over the last 6 months because of the pandemic. But yeah, it's really essential. Just give me a second. I have a feeling that my brother's going to come into the room. No, it's fine. Yeah, and you gotta go. No, go. The one about challenges in the UK. I mean, sort of what I mentioned just now. You'd have seen everything that's been going on with the royal family this week. Like the sheer confidence of the political elite in the UK that the UK's political ideology and practice around the world is like not racist is quite incredible. Like there is such a confidence because the Commonwealth exists and like yeah, we're not the head, you know, well, no, we are the head of state of many countries still. But it's been sold so effectively as a beneficial thing, right? We have consistent YouGov polling of the UK public who say that either the British Empire like did some great stuff around the world, and countries are better off as a result of our involvement in, you know, on their lands, or an ambivalence, which is even more problematic because the ambivalence almost means that there's like not really need for a conversation about it. So those are the challenges that we have. And then we have this, like, you know, there has been some significant moves around growing allyship within progressive white folks in the UK. And we saw a lot of the shapes of the Black Lives Matter movement last year looking way more multiracial than they've ever done. And it wasn't just led by Black people. There were very organized white people who were in those protests. And that is so needed. Like, that is exactly what needs to happen. But as a result of that, you've got this great construct of like, yeah, cancel culture and that being used as a means to silence dissent. We've got a new policing bill that's come in that is ultimately going to prevent much mass protest from happening in the future. And yeah, we've got a lot of, you know, the BBC has been taken over by a right-wing fascist, so they've stripped out a bunch of very important bits of cultural programming that was also essential for like the expression of dissenting voices and new ideas. And we've had a generation, you know, the generation of my brother, he's 26, who have like left school and gone through university in some of the most deprived times, you know, in terms of public infrastructure and collective organizing spaces. You know, we've had the austerity and like the stripping back of student, you know, increasing the student fees and stripping back of student support and unemployment. You know, the whole setup is awful. So finding capacity to organize in a way that people are going to be willing to hear you challenge colonial history and believe that there is a alternative, greater option for us that is abundant and just is difficult. Yeah, and I think we are all a little bit nervous about about the sort of authorities and institutions just like really clamping down on not even just clamping down, but just making it really difficult to like have these ideas become popularized. So I sense that, but that doesn't stop me. So
yeah, the whole royal family thing has been pretty, it's just I just cannot grasp how people don't find it ridiculous or absurd. There's the queen. But you spoke about futures and reimaginations, and I think that there have been like a lot of strains, like we also spoke of mutual aid and just like transformative communities, restorative communities, also cancel culture. So these are like just strains of emerging trends that we've observed. And an attendee asks, what kind of future do you see for an organization such as yours and Rethinking Economics, India Network, in the light of diverse global politics, especially in India? And I want to add to that, like sort of expand it a little bit. Within these trends, how do you think we can reimagine and move away from like certain things?
That's a great question. So the first part of that, in terms of the future of these, like of this, I reflected on how 3 years ago, the purpose of decolonizing economics was to bring a language towards racial capitalism and offer organizations a framework to think about systems change or economic systems change that understood like why decolonizing was important and isn't just a buzzword. And I think it would be interesting for Rethinking Economics to consider, like, and anticipate at what point the economic sort of economics education space is saturated with a bunch of economics students who know that their economics training is pretty bullshit and needs to be like, your kind of collective understanding of what you need to be reading about economics and what you need to be learning about economics needs to be different, and there'll be alternative curricula, and there'll be like conferences and spaces like this in which you can learn about that. That becomes a lot more diverse, and other actors are engaging in that practice. Like, where is your role then? And yeah, where do you want to put your kind of relationships and resources towards? And I feel that I'm more and more convinced. Yeah, I'm just more and more convinced by new institutions and alternative spaces. And I think that the more that we invest in those, the more we can practice the kind of economy that we need to establish. So, you know, alternative universities and educational practices, and in different places that are not cities, and, you know, not in kind of metropolitan areas, and like, you know, asking a question of like who our teachers are, and who are we learning from, and for Decolonizing Economics, you know, our strategy is UK focused, but ultimately there can't be a reparations program in the UK if it doesn't engage or like isn't led by global South leaders. So I know that the future of our work is centered on moving us out of the central frame of decision making, and finding I guess a governance structure, or like a decision-making process that is led by a different group to us. Like, we're not ready for that just yet, but I know that that's where we need to go. And the other thing that Nani and I talk about a lot is that, you know, we're both university educated, and we're both middle class, and we're working towards investing in multiracial community, working class communities. And we can't really do that with any integrity or accountability if that is not included within our, if that experience is not included in our kind of decision-making structure. So yeah, thinking about how to deepen our integrity is really important. Yeah, I feel like you had a second part of that question, which I haven't answered, about that imagination.
Yeah, it was about like just speculations for our futures and how you go about that.
I am quite pessimistic, but I see that as a good thing because it keeps me on my toes. I feel that there will be a community of people in the world who still trust the government, who still trust the idea of change will come through like electing a government who will have our back. So earlier this week, I was on another panel around international solidarity for political parties that were made up of activists. And in the Netherlands, there's elections next week. And someone I met in 2016 while I was doing the European organizing work is a candidate for this kind of anti-capitalist political party in the Netherlands, and his name is Quincy. And that was a great conversation. And I'm like, really great that you are committing your life to political leadership and shifting the political institutions. But we have settled as a group, particularly in Europe, that like the state will always be there for us. And it's clear that that's not the way that like it's going, and hasn't been definitely for the last sort of 30 years. So at least in Europe, my kind of, my prediction is that some people will still rest on that idea that like politics, I feel like democracy is crumbling within the existing institutions pretty quickly. Like we can see that from like the way that Facebook runs, the way that like the US elections happened, and definitely what's happening in the UK at the moment. We need to begin creating like our own democratic institutions within the space that we have focused on as being like our community and our place. because there's absolutely no way in which that can happen. Or there's no way we can rely on other people to like provide that for us. And in terms of India, like we anticipate moving like back to India at some point in the next under a decade, and we are constantly thinking about what life is going to be like there, and you know, where we can sort of sustain ourselves and build a community there. And I think that I hope that communities like enlightened communities within India like move fast around a similar investment around investing resources directly in communities and creating spaces to have a healthy relationship with power that kind of speaks more about personal dynamics and positionality than we are ever supported to explore within our own kind of like standard education system and families. Like we aren't, like most families don't have healthy relationships with power and are really centered around the patriarchy. So like it's really up to, you know, collectives and organizations that do have a more progressive outlook to begin experimenting and being accountable towards that practice.
Thank you for that answer. Yeah, it is. It is going to be like a hard few decades, I think.
Yeah.
But I think we have our last closing question. I think I'm just going to like mix a few of the questions that we've received and add. So there was a question about how do you manage merging boundaries between personal and professional narratives? And in general, I think as someone who works with climate justice and public health, you must have been exposed to a lot of stuff, and you still are, I'm pretty sure. And so how do you deal with the emotional upheaval of just being in these spaces?
That's a great question. I'm an oversharer, so the question around boundaries in personal and professional spaces is really not a question for me to answer. Like I notoriously overshare a lot about my personal background and my experiences. I use the narrative, you know, my partner worked for a climate justice organization in the US and basically had his account frozen by the Indian government back in 2014. And a lot of, when I talked a lot about my kind of personal awakening around my British privilege, centered around the experience of trying to get him to the UK on a visa that would sustain him here, and just how challenging that was. And his lawyers were just like, get out of the country as soon as you can. But we couldn't get him out of the country. He actually landed in Germany and we had to kind of like wait a while in Germany before he can come to the UK. Like he's incredibly privileged to be able to do that as well. And there are obviously activists who are dying in India because they cannot escape the brutality that is being imposed on them. I use that story to provide like multiple kind of perspectives of like a context. So like in India, he has privilege. Like in the UK, he's oppressed and like is someone who's trying to come over to the UK. Like in the UK, I'm privileged. So I use it in a way to kind of give people, particularly people with more privilege, I think, than me, the chance to see the complexity that can exist within one person's existence and how you use that to make decisions around like your choices and your strategies and your purpose. And I would say that if you feel safe and if you feel empowered to speak about your personal experiences to an audience that you've never met or to like one individual, then I feel that it can be very compelling and it can be incredibly transformative, and really the only way in which you can create trust. But you have to make the decision as to whether the space that you're in is that place that is held in order for you to do that. Either you create the space yourself, you create the space for someone else, to feel that they're able to share their personal experiences that are mixed between, like, because in the end, obviously I have a profession, but I'm driven by a personal purpose that connects to my experience, but also like to those I'm in relationship with. And I don't think, I would love to see the demise of professionalism within social justice organizing. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but I do think by like creating the space for giving proper introductions and building relationships is really important. And it really is your choice about how much you're willing to like to share about yourself, and to just recognize how you feel in your body when you're doing that, and also to be prepared for other people to be like not great about the truth, because we're not practiced at hearing other people's pain or trauma, and yeah, and to decide yourself around that. And then I was possibly asked a similar question earlier this week around like what keeps me motivated, and it's just really like seeing and hearing stories of success around what I want to see happen in the strategy that we have in Decolonizing Economics, like exist elsewhere. So one of the best like mailing lists I'm on is the New Economy Coalition. Again, it's in the US, but they do have a really good kind of digest of like solidarity economics in practice internationally. And so, you know, the cooperative movement is really strong in a lot of global South countries, and a lot of it was invested by the state, which is also really great. And so there is a kind of a culture there that can be worked on, and it means so much to like read those stories, be inspired by them, know that they're in action, know that this work is growing, or is like re-emerging, because a lot of it is historical and existed before. Yeah, I read a lot of stuff about pretty traumatic things around people's experience of health inequalities, and you know, I started at medical school. I probably didn't mention that. Like my first year at university was at medical school, and then I did a kind of standard biomedical science degree because I realized that health was political, and didn't feel that kind of one-to-one care was really going to do much for my political purpose. And so all of the friends I grew up with and who I'm still in touch with now are medics. And so we do talk a lot, you know, the pandemic has been a space in which we share stories around the experience of healthcare workers and what they see their communities dealing with. And it is that just gives me the fire to know that we need to move fast and like, and keep moving on, and reaffirms that the strategy that I think we have for now is the right strategy. And that's just what gives me hope. Also, like, I do a lot of yoga and I've learned to run, and I've got a lot of like creative, I try to be as creative as possible and I do a lot of work in the garden, because I think you just don't realize when you're doing this how much like you hold in here and how much needs to be released. And so that's also what kind of keeps me and sustains me.
I thank you for that answer. I bunked yoga class today, so that was a good reminder. I should stop doing that. But it was really great talking to you, and you have like, I was so nervous when I was told that I will be doing this. Like I was like, cool, but I'm gonna be really scared. But talking to you really put me at ease. It was really wonderful.
Great. I hope this is not the last time that we connect, and I'm really excited about the work that you're doing. And like I said, it's really important for us as Decolonizing Economics to have these relationships. And so I just look forward to the next chat that we have, and find ways to work together. And kudos to everyone who stuck around as well.
Yes. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who attended today's session, and I hope you had a wonderful evening. And yeah, I guess we will. Okay, I don't have a closing line planned, so I'm just going to fade into silence.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.